Well, hello everyone. My name is Ben Eady. I'm the online media manager for ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled BA Effectiveness Through Social Traceability and Collaboration. Today's featured speakers are Derwin Harris and Ashley Lund from JAMA Software, and the webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the Q&A session. So make sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions feature of the webinar software. I'd also like to say a thank you to JAMA Software for sponsoring this event. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Derwin to get us started.
Well, thank you very much. So hello, everybody. Just a quick audio check. Let me know if you're not hearing me, though I suppose if you weren't hearing me, you wouldn't know to let me know. But hopefully that's working out. And so today's webinar is really around BA effectiveness through social traceability and collaboration. Now, that's quite a mouthful, and there's quite a bit to cover. I do want to make a quick note that this is somewhat of a part 2 from a webinar I did a few weeks back, specifically around collaboration. So while I will be touching on kind of some ideas of collaboration, there is a webinar that I did that really focused on how collaboration can make you more productive. And so today is kind of expanding on that to sort of touch on how traceability can really be a tool in helping you do more collaboration, being more social, and ultimately, as a business analyst, being more effective. And so that's really the goal today, and we'll talk more about that. So quick introduction about myself. My name is Derwin Harris. I am currently a product manager here at JAMA Software. I'm also one of the co-founders. And it's been a very interesting and wonderful experience here at JAMA. I have a background in development, in project management. I've worked in a wide range of different organizations prior to JAMA, from sort of the medical world to other custom projects. As an IBM business consultant, I did training. But while at JAMA, it's been amazing because I've worked with such a wide range of different customers, from medical device to technology to software, agile companies to more waterfall. And I've really been able to sort of learn and empathize with those different kind of customers to understand what's working for them and what's not working with them or for them. So it's been very exciting. You can find me on Twitter at Derwin if you want to reach out or post anything. Always looking forward to connecting with more folks. So real quick about who we are as a company. We were founded in 2006. We're now over 600 enterprise customers, and many of them are part of the Fortune 100. And as I mentioned, our product really enables and helps these customers deliver products more successfully. And as I mentioned, we have a wide range of different types of customers, from technology to healthcare to semiconductor, pure software. And so our product is incredibly flexible that helps organizations manage the complexity of their products in general. And so we'll touch a little bit on that during the conversation, but again, today's webinar is really focused on more high-level how traceability can be used to be more collaborative and ultimately to be more effective as a business analyst. So real quick agenda of today. I'll do a quick recap of kind of my belief and our belief, our understanding of collaboration today. Collaboration as a term has evolved greatly over the last 10 years, so I just want to touch on that a little bit. Then I'll spend some time just really talking about traceability and really rethinking the concept of traceability. It's a word that's been around a long time. If you look up the definition of traceability, you're going to get a very sort of technical definition of what it means. But I want to rethink it a little bit and broaden that concept. We'll talk a bit about where you fit in, you as the attendees here, whether you're a business analyst, a product manager. I'm using the term business analyst, but really it's referring to this role that's focusing on the definition and the understanding of what the organization is trying to build as a product or a application. We'll go through a quick example. This is an example that I experienced prior to JAMA, but I think it's relevant even today. I'll mention healthcare.gov, but we won't go into details about it. We'll talk about Agile and traceability, because I know that the terms aren't necessarily used together in the same sentence. If you did a search for the two of them, I don't know whether you'd find many results. And then we'll really close out with looking at traceability as a tool and how tools can be used and the different options you have available to you for really making use of what you've learned today. So as I mentioned, we'll jump right into the idea of collaboration, and we'll just summarize this. And the question that comes up is it really a buzzword, or is collaboration providing real business value? And as I mentioned, my previous webinar talked mostly around productivity and how collaboration can be used to really enable organizations to be more efficient. And part of this is the idea that collaboration is a much broader concept, and there's a lot of studies that have been done. And if you think back on when the Agile Manifesto came out, it kind of ushered in this idea of the importance and the value of collaboration, and this idea of co-located teams and how those teams being co-located are ultimately more effective, and that act of being co-located promotes the feeling of involvement and the inclusion, which helps drive not only innovation, alignment, and a lot of benefits that we're looking for better product delivery. What's also happened in the last 10 years is that since 2001, which is when the manifesto came out, we have evolved as technically in terms of how we collaborate. If you think about Facebook, Twitter, Yammer, software, there's mobile phones, everything about our world has fundamentally changed, and so the way in which we collaborate has fundamentally changed. And so the point is that while in the early days of Agile there was this idea that co-located teams was the end-all be-all of providing this sort of cohesive involvement and alignment, today we're able to accomplish that through other means. Now, with that said, there's definitely modes of collaboration that exist and have existed even prior to that, to the Agile Manifesto or to the buzzword of collaboration. Email is a great example. I mean, that's been around for a long time, and it's still used today as a mode of collaboration. Now, there's pros and cons of all of these different modes. Email's benefit is that it's widely used and widely known. No one needs to be trained on email when they start an organization, though one could predict in the next 10 years that new hires won't understand or know how to do email. They will only know how to text or use specific software. Don't know whether that's true or not, but you never know. IM is another example where it's a great way in which organizations can connect with each other and have conversations and do collaboration. The drawback of instant message is that it's instant and it's lost. The conversation that takes place and the result of that is lost within that conversation. It's not open to other folks, and I talked about in the previous webinar about how that reduces the productivity because that conversation is then useful for other folks down the road. Meetings are another great way of collaborating. Obviously, the face-to-face, the dynamics of meetings are fantastic, but as we've seen in articles and books, that there's this whole idea of introverts versus extroverts, that the whole brainstorming concept is questionable. There's times and places where it works, but it's not, again, the end-all be-all, and the conversation that takes place in there is oftentimes lost as well. We spend an hour, we come to these great conclusions, and the question then becomes, to what degree does that get relayed back into the work that we're doing and the rest of the team that's ultimately impacted by those conversations? Meetings happen all the time where there's revelations, but those revelations don't get sort of disseminated back out to the rest of the organization in an effective manner. Drive-bys are probably not something that you would think of when you think of collaboration, but it's a reality, especially in organizations that are utilizing more open seating frameworks where there's not the cubes anymore, and they're using this to spawn innovation and create an open collaborative atmosphere, but it also creates a lot more drive-bys where people walk up and ask you a question and tap you on the shoulder, oftentimes regardless of whether you have headphones on or not. And the greatness of that is that it's highly collaborative, and you have these engaging conversations. And I live and work in an environment that's exactly like this, and to be honest, I enjoy the drive-bys, but the conversations do get lost, and sometimes we end up rehashing those same conversations, or somewhere else within the organization a similar conversation is taking place. Last but not least is the concept of business social software. So what we're seeing with the advent of Facebook and Yammer and all these products that are really helping the social sort of public sphere embrace the idea of collaboration and interaction, we're seeing that translate into the business world where tools and solutions are embracing these concepts of social and collaboration in a way that's helping organizations be more efficient and be more effective. So I'll talk a bit about that in terms of how that relates to traceability, because the big difference between sort of the public social sphere is that businesses have very specific needs, and the content that you're working around is much more meaningful. And so over time, this is something that's taken place and has evolved over the past few decades. Early on, it was nothing but meetings and conversations that were taking place and the teams. But the software itself that we were building was less complex. There wasn't as much of a embedded, integrated type of environment, and what we were building wasn't as complex. You know, software over the years, or even software and hardware, has become increasingly complex. I mean, you look at cars alone. I remember my dad buying me a car back in the 80s, and he was so excited because you could see the road through the engine. You know, they just nowadays, there's no possible way I would ever be able to work on a car. They're incredibly complex. And with this complexity, the tools that have enabled us to communicate and work through and track the changes that are ongoing have also evolved from documents to emails to more collaborative software. And so that's sort of a reality of our world, is that what we're building is more complex, and therefore it requires the tools that we're using to become more efficient and support that complexity. And so just to really highlight this difference of business versus social, on the left-hand side is a screenshot of a conversation that's taking place inside of JAMA, and the key here is that the conversation is happening around meaningful content, and there's meaningful responses that are happening in association with this. In fact, there's even decisions being made and questions being answered. And the difference here is that this conversation is relevant, ongoing. It's not once it's done, it's forgotten. It's something that we'll go back to time and time again to sort of readdress or rethink or gain alignment, because when you think about a product that's being built, when we're looking at a requirement or a test case or a use case or any of those things, they have a lifespan, and that lifespan is more than a day. It's a week, a month, sometimes a year, depending on what you're building, versus the right-hand side, which is a typical Facebook post. This happens to be mine from last summer, and it's long gone and forgotten. It was relevant that day, and people posted that day, but no one's gone back to this, and there's no ongoing conversation, and there's no reason to go back to this and look at this for some historical understanding or conceptualization. It's simply in the moment and forgotten, whereas business software has the need for what we're talking about and what we're having a conversation to have a ongoing existence of relevancy. So just to sort of highlight that is that, you know, when I think about collaboration, it's not just for the sake of collaboration. It's not just conversations. It's where there's a purpose. There's a reason for what we're having a conversation about. There's a point to it, and there's justification. It's really the reason for which something is done or created, or for which something exists. There's a life to the content, to the data that we're working on, and this really sets the stage well for traceability, because traceability is, as we'll talk more in depth, is the connection, the thread between not only the data that we're working on, this meaningful content, but the conversations and the decisions and the people that are ultimately connected to that, the organization. It's much broader in scope in terms of how it's being worked. So the question I ask today is traceability an old school concept, or is it a modern necessity? And that's sort of what I'll be addressing throughout the presentation. But let's do a quick poll just to sort of get a sense for how you use traceability, or to what degree you have a trace matrix. So the question I have is your trace matrix up to date? And this assumes that you have a trace matrix, so it's either yes or it's no. If you don't know, then that either means you don't have a trace matrix or it's not your job. But go ahead and just fill that out, and we'll sort of see the results. And to be honest, I haven't thought what I'm expecting. I think what I'm hoping for is I'm hoping that Most of you are saying yes, which will be fantastic. I have a follow-up question down the road, which I'll ask in relation to that. But I'm hoping that not everybody is saying not my job, because my assumption is that most of you on this call do deal with this world. And in fact, what I'm seeing with the results is that a majority of you say, I don't know. 34% say, I don't know. And so that's a little unnerving a little bit. And as again, I'll ask later to sort of get a sense for who's on the call. The least amount of you, 13%, said not my job, which is interesting as well. And I'll sort of touch on that, because one of the things I'll hit on is this idea that traceability is everyone's job on many levels, because it impacts you across the board. And so we'll talk about that a bit more. And then about 20% of you said yes. So 22% said yes, which is fantastic. That's actually pretty high. 30% said no, which is worrisome. 34% said I don't know, which is even more worrisome. And then 13% said not my job, and we'll sort of touch on that a bit more. So how is traceability done today? The reality is, that most of you are doing it like this. It's in Excel, and you're either building what's called a trace matrix in its traditional sense. A trace matrix is the one that's sort of behind the view there. It's just it's a mapping of one item set to another item set. It's one direction, or it's only mapping two different item types, as I'll call them. Whereas the one in the forefront's more of an explorer, where it's showing multiple levels of traceability in a single direction, and there's some advanced stuff in here where you've got links. And again, there's lots of different versions and templates of an Excel trace matrix. You can find templates out there, and people have their own specific formats. I've seen every possible little variation, but at the end of the day, they're all really similar in terms of what they're trying to accomplish, and that is they're trying to link the data. Right? So the basic understanding of traceability is I need to link my data. I need to link the requirements to the downstream information. Now, in this example, I'm kind of using Agile terms because I want to raise a little bit of a question here in terms of, is traceability a waterfall concept, or is it more of an Agile concept? And I'll touch on that more, but most people are familiar with it from waterfall, in the sense that you're going from high-level requirements to low-level requirements to test cases and on down. So I'm demonstrating here some Agile terms just to sort of prove a point. But the reality is that the basic understanding of traceability is connecting data with other data throughout the system. And the purpose of that, and this is a quote from Wikipedia, traceability is the ability to verify the history, location, or application of an item by means of documents recorded identification. And that's just a clear indicator of the old way of thinking about traceability. It's about coverage. It's about identifying gaps in the data. It's about identifying change, or looking at the impact of change. But it's critical to note here that this is only relevant if the matrix is current. There's no way that you're going to be able to identify or view the impact of change in a real scenario if the matrix is not up to date. You have inaccurate information for what you're basing that understanding on. And so it's critical at that stage to have a current viable view of the trace matrix. So for the most part, traceability is used for identifying coverage gaps. And as well, and one thing I didn't highlight on here is an audit trail. It's oftentimes a after-the-fact consideration, like, oh crap, we need to create a trace matrix in order to provide that to the FDA. That's for another example of it. The problem with using this sort of old traditional mode is that it's oftentimes, and this is just what I've seen in the workforce, is that it's oftentimes out of date. It's oftentimes error-prone, and when I mean error-prone, it's related to that error, that out of date, that it's just not reflecting the current scenario. It could also reflect inaccuracies. It's a manual job that someone's having to go through, and they're having to pull from external data sources. I mean, this is an incredibly, oftentimes cumbersome and monotonous process that some poor soul is going through to create this view, and that's their life oftentimes, is looking at old documents and mapping the IDs back and trying to figure out where things connect, and that's incredibly painful. It's data-centric, which is sort of the core of the philosophical difference that I'm talking about here today. And last but not least, it really it really lacks scope. And so, and the reason I bring this up is that when I've seen or talked to folks about what traceability means to them, it's really oftentimes focused around this specific area within the traceability. The requirements down to the test cases, or if it's FAA, they need to go down to the code. It's always based on some separate need from an audit trail or from a coverage. It's not designed or intended to bring the company together around product delivery. And again, that's the fundamental difference that I'm talking about, is that when you're looking at traceability, because it's hard to do and because it takes a lot of time, you typically reduce the scope down to only the items that you need to link. So let's rethink traceability. Let's step back for a moment and just say, what is traceability and what is the purpose of traceability? There are concepts and terms that I'm considering, and I want to relay back here. Evolution, communication, decisions, alignment, living, and scope. So what do these mean? What does it mean when I say traceability is about an evolution? It's about iteration. What do I mean by communication, about decisions? These are really different concepts and not terms that you think about when you think about traceability. So we'll look at evolution first. Evolution is the idea that products don't change, they evolve. Right? If they simply changed, that would be very straightforward. But they're really an evolution that's taking place. We're going through this iterative. If we're building software and we're an agile environment, then we're building a minimum viable product. If we're doing lean development, the minimum viable product, and then we sort of learn from the feedback, and we make a tweak to it, and we get that out there, and then we make a tweak, and we get that out there. So it's this evolving process. And even in sort of more traditional environments, there's an evolution. Even in hardware environments where the evolution is at the sort of definition phase, where we're really trying to understand and expand, and as we share the vision with more and more folks, we learn more and we adapt and we change. And so this is really critical because it's what allows us, it enables us, understanding this concept, understanding that products that we're building has this evolution, enables us to really recognize the importance of traceability as a connector, as an enabler for this evolution. So let's talk about communication then. Communication is so critical with an organization, and I'll touch on this concept, and this goes back to the collaboration. Communication is something that's happening all the time. The problem is that if we simply rely on communication in more of a ad hoc, chaotic way, we're losing lots of information. We're rehashing constant information. So if you're familiar with the telephone story, if you rely on people to communicate amongst themselves without any form of connection to that or capturing of that conversation, the risk at the end of the day is that what you understand is going to be different. And this is just fundamentally reality, and it's not a result of too many folks. It's not a result of, some might say, well, in Agile you have the customer sitting directly with the developer. I've seen, when you go back, and the experience that I had was in elementary school where we did this telephone where somebody told a story. It's always between two individuals that the problem occurred, and it's oftentimes that first translation. It's that first translation of the information to that first person that the breakdown begins. What makes it worse is having multiple layers to that, which is simply the reality of most organizations. And so with respect to traceability, communication today is not associated with traceability. It's associated with data, as I've been saying all along. So the question to you is, well, what happens if we suddenly take into consideration the people and the communication in association or in relation to the traceability? Because ultimately they are connected and ultimately they are impacted by the work on the data. When you think of impact analysis, business analysts, product managers say, well, I'm going to change this requirement, and what is the impact on the data if I make the change? But the real question should be, what is the impact on the people associated with this item, and how do I engage them in a conversation such that I can understand the impact better? Just looking at the fact that this requirement impacts 5 test cases isn't enough. It oftentimes requires, and in fact organizations go through very arduous sort of change control processes to pull people in, have meetings, have conversations in order to understand that impact. Traceability is going to help you do that more effectively. In addition, there's oftentimes layers upon layers of communication that's happening outside of those core connected users. So when I say that there's a user connected to an epic versus a user connected to a strategic objective, that's a great reference point, but there's oftentimes people outside of that person has worked with to come to that conclusion, and having that visibility, or at least being able to get to that person, but then having some insight into the conversations that they had, is going to help you make more intelligent decisions. Which ultimately brings us to this idea of decisions. And I highlight this idea of decisions because I don't think it's talked about enough. We talk a lot about collaboration, we talk a lot about communication, and that feels very open-ended. It just feels like we're going to end up in a situation where we're just having endless conversations. At some point in time, you have to progress forward. You have to come to some conclusion. Not everyone may like that conclusion, but are you doing it as a democracy? Are you voting, or is it consensus, or is it that there's some overrider who makes that ultimate decision? But as an organization building a product, it's critical that you do move forward at some point in time. You can't get stagnated in one place, and the decisions become a critical part of that. But how do you make decisions if you don't have access or visibility into the big picture? Right? Right now, decisions are happening every day, and they're happening over and over again. But to make a decision, it's critical that you have an understanding of the impacted information and the impacted people and the reason why you're trying to make that decision. So as an example here, it might be that I'm a product manager and I'm working on an epic and I need to make a decision. Now the question is, who do I go to? Do I go to the developers to make that decision? Is it my VP that's going to help me make that decision? Is it the CEO? Is there some strategic objective that the organization as a whole has made that's going to enable my decision? This is how decisions become intelligent, is that when they're based on actual facts and understanding and alignment within the entire organization, I can make a more honest decision. Otherwise, I'm at risk of making a decision that's going to backfire down the road because it wasn't based on, or it was counter to something we had discussed months prior. This is sort of critical to that process. So a couple of things to consider around decisions. They're necessary oftentimes to move things forward. Whether you call it a decision or whether you call it a something different, it's a moment in time where you're having a conversation with someone and you're coming to some conclusion of, okay, I think I understand now, we're going to do this. That's a decision. It's oftentimes a way of providing a clear context as to why. If a decision was made by the product team a month in advance based on a customer conversation or based on a conversation with the executives that the developer is another month later working on, for them to be able to go and look upstream to that product manager and the decision that was made, that developer is going to be smarter for it. I know from experience that when I was working on stories or use cases that were derived from information that had conversations that had taken place weeks, if not months prior, I would have been a better developer knowing that context. Oftentimes, the people who make the decisions reside outside the team, and the reason I bring this up is that it becomes important to understand how and where you're tracking those decisions. Are those folks available via mobile? Where are you capturing that information? Are you capturing it in a system or a tool, or are you capturing it in the Excel doc itself, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And it really just provides context around it. The people who benefit from decisions oftentimes come later, and that's just something to understand as a business analyst or as anybody within the organization, is that conversations you are having today have an impact on the product days, weeks, months later. Everything you're doing today has an impact, and so it's critical that we enable folks downstream or down time frame to take advantage of that conversation, to sort of glean the insights that you gleaned at that moment, because that's what's really going to drive better products. And so just a quick screenshot, again, I'm just throwing these out there as examples. We have a mechanism within JAMA that tracks actual decisions. So it's not just collaboration and conversations, it's the fact that I can have a decision, and those decisions can be made via a mobile device. So this is just an example of how we're going to, or you're going to be seeing solutions evolving to really bring this concept and this importance of traceability sort of into a more cohesive environment that's really enabling you to accomplish this more effectively. And then alignment becomes critical, and alignment's one of these terms that I'm a huge fan of, because it really is, how do you ensure that your employees and that your team is motivated to build what you're asking them to build? And I know this is a struggle that a lot of organizations go through, and it's something that business analysts and product manager are frustrated with, where you have this idea and you have this vision and you're trying to relay that vision to the development team so that they're motivated to build that product, because that motivation, that excitement and that passion that the developers hold and the QA holds is going to enable the product to be more innovative. It's going to enable them to think outside the box and understand the direction that we're going. And this is why alignment is so critical. And it doesn't just go downstream, it goes upstream. You as a business analyst or as a product manager understanding the strategic objectives and the direction that the company is going, and the marketplace. If you've got a marketing team or a product marketing team that's bringing in really important information from where the market's going or from specific customers, that information and that context is going to really help ensure that you as an organization, you as in a team, are really in alignment. And that's sort of the best case scenario. What a lot of companies are doing is that they're sort of taking the Google model and breaking teams up into smaller teams, sort of creating these little mini startups, because they've realized that people are disconnected, they're out of alignment, and the easiest and simplest way to do that is to put them into smaller teams. But the reality is that collaborative software and traceability can really help those teams be more in alignment without the need for creating these separate teams, especially in really complex products where you can't afford a small team. It has to be a big team. And so there's a lot of different studies out there around the concept of alignment, and I try to figure out which ones to sort of pull in and demonstrate, but there's a ton of studies to show that not only have we become more collaborative, but organizations have become more networked, more flexible, they're more dynamic, they're expanding. That, as I've mentioned, the products are becoming more complex, which requires larger teams, it requires more diverse skill sets, and so these organizations are really relying on those work teams, and it's not as it was years ago where one person had all the skills and experience. I've been on a lot of customer sites where there's that person who's been there for decades, who has all of the information in their head, and that's really scary for organizations, and it's problematic because that person, while they have a lot of experience and skills, it's not truly tapping into the innovative, creative aspects of what their potential is as an organization. So it's important to sort of extract that and connect that information throughout the entire organization. So a bit on scope, and just to reiterate this fact that there can be, when you look at traceability, and this is oftentimes the first thing I ask when I'm on site with a customer sort of exploring their existing process, is I always say, all right, what is the information that you're tracking? I start with the information, and then I start connecting the teams that are involved with that information. And oftentimes what I find is that there's a subset of information that they're tracking. Well, we track the system requirements and the technical specifications, and that's it. And then as I explore, I find out, well, how, this example here is sort of from a typical medical device flow where they have validation and verification and market requirements and user requirements. But what I oftentimes find is that there's a whole world of information upstream with market requirements and information that's being brought in that isn't part of the traceability because it's not required from the FDA to have that high-level information. But what that means is that they're missing the value of traceability as a way in which organizations can be more in alignment and have better communication. So that's why I bring up scope, because oftentimes organizations see traceability as a necessary evil, and so they're just tapping into the bare minimum traceability. But the ability to expand that out is going to provide a huge amount of value. So One more poll. Who is responsible for traceability? The question becomes, is it one person, several people, everyone, or we don't do traceability? And obviously, I don't know whether, maybe I should have asked this earlier before I sort of got on my soapbox about how important it is for everyone, because maybe I've skewed the results. I'm seeing so far that the everyone is much larger than everything. So that's fantastic. I love this. I don't know whether I've convinced you or when you came in convinced already. So this is fantastic. I'm seeing 8% of you said one person, and that's oftentimes what I see in the marketplace when I go to customer sites, that there is a person that's responsible for the trace matrix. The next, actually the lowest one is we don't do traceability. So that's fantastic that there's a small percentage of you that don't do traceability. It's too bad that small percentage that don't do traceability. It might be that you consider yourselves more agile. I'll touch on that a little bit, but that might be the case. As I mentioned, the highest level is 65%, so that's fantastic. And I totally agree. So another way of thinking about that is traceability a living concept? So there's this difference between static and living, and this is just expanding on this notion of if you're tracking your traceability as data, that you're just tracking it for impact analysis, you're just tracking it for coverage, it's somewhat of a static view into the world. It's fairly limited, whereas there's an idea that I'm really proposing here, which is how do you make that traceability a living concept within your organization? The slide's not forwarding. There we go. So looking at the static, the reason static is problematic is that it's not connected to the people. I keep tying back to this idea that when you look at your organization, oftentimes we're looking at traceability in one view and we're looking at collaboration in another view, and they're separate. Traceability is for coverage, collaboration is for conversations and innovation and moving forward. But if they're not together, then you end up with a result like this, where there is a connection, there is a fundamental connection between people within your organization, and there are changes that are taking place within that organization. If those changes aren't connected to the traceability, then they're happening in isolation, and that's a risk. Whereas if it's a living sort of concept, that it's there and it's available and it's current and it's something that everybody has visibility into, or that it's part of their job, then those changes that are made are visible to the folks that are impacted, and it's accessible by people within the organization. And this again is really driving us towards this alignment, because the reality is when you think about your role, and your role being business analyst, product manager, or really anyone within the organization, you are in the middle of a swirling cosmic storm is the way I like to think about it. This fact that you have information coming at you from a lot of different angles. And I reference the business analysts and the product managers mostly because you're really, for the most part, at the center of this storm. Development's definitely in the mix. People higher up, such as sales or executives or the customers are sort of on the outer fringes, and they're feeding information into that. But there's this middle area where someone is responsible for kind of defining and tracking and managing all this work that's going on, both from an input and from an output, and making sure that everybody's in alignment within that. And so it's this sort of swirling, ongoing, iterative. And when you think about Agile, what Agile's done is it's made this even more complex, right? And no one said Agile is going to be easier for folks. In fact, it's going to make it harder, because to be iterative and to be uber collaborative, you're going to be dealing with a lot. To embrace change means embracing more work. At the end of the day, the hope is that it's going to make a better product, but no one ever said that it's going to make things easier. In fact, it's going to make things harder. And so this sort of swirling conversation. So my opinion is that traceability is what's going to help control this swirling storm and keep people in alignment and keep people aware of the strategic direction that we're going, or the level to which development is already underway, so that you can manage that more effectively. Everybody benefits from traceability: stakeholders, developers, QA, auditors, onlookers such as VPs and executives, just the fact that they have the ability to go in and see how everything's connected and who's connected is such a powerful concept. I mean, imagine that kind of view where I'm able, anyone within the organization, to sort of see the impact of what I care about, and not only what's being built, but who's involved, to be able to see that, wow, this idea, this module that's being built is involving 20, 30, 100 different people, and there's tons of conversations, and there's hundreds of decisions that have been made. That's incredibly powerful to sort of recognize not only the work that's taking place, but to sort of be in alignment with the kinds of conversations that are happening. That's really powerful, and really anyone with a vested interest. So real quick on Agile, because I know I've touched on it a little bit, and I think it's worth just highlighting it a little more, because I know Agile's there's a lot of debate around Agile. It's a powerful concept. I was just at an exchange sort of panel on Friday at Portland State University, where we were having a conversation around the ideas, the benefits of Agile, and it was amazing for me because the room really sort of understood that Agile is less of a methodology and a process and more of a concept that's there to enable or empower teams to be self-regulating, to find their inner strength. We ended up on a lot of conversations around how teams can sort of become more productive, become more efficient by embracing these concepts of Agile. It's not about having stand-ups or about having stories and epics. It's about utilizing the concepts of Agile to improve the dynamics of your team. And so the reason I bring this up is that traceability doesn't have to be this sort of waterfall concept. When you think about an Agile project, there is, even in the Agile circles where you're going from story to iteration to release to roadmap, where there's these constant cycles, there are still many stages within that to where the content that we're building, it's not that we're building just a flat list of information and starting with that. The backlog is a valuable resource, but there's a lot of work that goes into creating that backlog. There's market research, there's customer inquiries, there's lots of interviews that are taking place. There's so much happening. There's feedback from support, and all of this work is helping us. And as a product management team or as a business analyst, your job is to sort of decipher and translate and really uncover the pain points. It's when you're talking to a customer and the customer says, "I want the button to be blue," it's that conversation to identify, do you really need a button? Maybe it's something different, and uncovering the pain points, and that conversation and coming to that conclusion is part of Agile, and that's not something where you just simply write a story. There's oftentimes, let me understand the theme around this, like what is this tied to, and that's why traceability is a critical part of Agile. So again, just to reiterate, do projects need traceability, and considering all the concepts that I've talked about, change, iterative, collaborations, decisions, these are all I don't think anyone would argue that these are not concepts of Agile, embracing change, being more iterative, being more collaborative, and tracking decisions that are happening. This is all critical. If traceability provides visibility and alignment into these things such that teams can be more efficient, is critical to that. So a quick example, this was a government project that I was on, and I've kind of touched on this a little bit, and just what I want to really highlight here is that we were in an environment that embraced Agile as a development team, but the reality was the requirements were defined a year in advance before the development team even existed. And this exists for organizations out there. There's no getting around the fact that there's RFPs, there's a need for requirements, there's a need for contracts. And again, the Agile Manifesto doesn't say that we throw contract negotiation away. It just means that contract negotiation should be valued less than interactions, and that's 100% true. So if there's a contract, it's critical that that contract and those requirements be tied to the effort happening by the development team, such that if changes occur, it's possible for us to easily and effectively see the information. For me, it was a disconnected world. I had no idea that the requirements existed or what they said. We were sort of working off of secondhand information, and that became a problem where there was scope creep, there were added requirements, and I've actually talked to some folks who were on related projects of the healthcare.gov, and the problem that they faced was that there were multiple versions of documents that were being created because the requirements were constantly changed. And it's not a question of whether Agile would have helped them or not. It's a question of why weren't they connected to those changes in a more meaningful, effective manner, such that they were aware of those changes sooner and that they were in alignment with those changes. I heard stories of one developer was working on version 10 of the document and another developer was working on version 15. And why is that? That's because there was a breakdown in traceability. There wasn't a connection of traceability to the actual people within the organization. So teams were out of alignment, efficiency was hindered, communication takes longer than necessary because you've got to track things down, you've got to have meetings, there's constant discussions and hallway conversations and emails flying around. It just takes time. And the decisions and changes were top of mind and not contextual. This is also a huge risk of organizations that aren't tracking decisions that are made. We become an organization that focuses on top of mind ideas. Like, I just got off a call with a customer and here's what they said, and suddenly that's the end-all be-all topic of conversation. Getting better at understanding kind of previous conversations and tying it to where we're going is critical, and that works with Agile as well. So how could this have been improved? I think just having a trace matrix would have been great. Like that didn't even exist. So I'm glad to hear that most of you actually have traceability, and so that's a necessary thing. Keeping it up to date is critical. Making it available so it's not just something that one person owns or a small subset of people. It really should be something that everybody has access to. It should be published somewhere. Linking data to actual requirements. Those requirements oftentimes, this is that whole error prone. It should be something that I can click to or get to and see the actual requirement in its entirety. It's that way the whole entire text maybe doesn't have to be in the trace matrix. And then really linking that data to decisions and key conversations, bringing into that coverage explorer or that trace matrix some way in which you can see specific quotes by a customer or specific decisions that were made and a date and a person associated with that, so that it's clear to me that this conversation already took place. For me, step 2 is really thinking about a tool. Tools are designed to do this better. Excel just is not designed to do this in the way in which we're entering into as we get into this complex world. It's time to really evolve from that state. But the reality is many people still use it. So let's tie this together a bit and talk a bit about efficiency versus effective. And the reason you've heard me use the term efficient and effective sort of throughout the presentation, I don't know whether you caught on to how and when I used it, but there is a difference. Efficiency is about doing things in the right manner, and effective is about doing the right things. And the difference here is somewhat subtle. The good of being efficient is that you're perfecting a well-streamlined process. And so if there's a way in which you do things or a way in which you're tracking, your organization can be incredibly efficient at updating that trace matrix. It requires 10 hours of work, but it's really efficient. It's about reducing errors because you've gotten quite good at it. It's about removing redundancies because you've figured out the most streamlined way of accomplishing something, and you perfected that. The bad part of efficiency is that it could be that you're incredibly efficient at a 50-step process. It could be that you're really good at doing something that's incredibly monotonous. And it could be that you're being incredibly efficient at something that's very redundant. It could be that efficiency is efficiently doing something poorly. And that's the risk, is looking at your process and asking yourself, okay, is this efficient or is it effective? And that's where the difference really comes in, because being effective is about getting it right. It's about getting answers. It's about being decisive, moving things forward, and having that context, not being reactionary, right? And not being surprised or blindsided. So for me as a product manager, to be effective in my job, I need to have access to information, access to who's involved within the organization. I need to have at my fingertips the understanding of the strategic objective placed down by the CEO and the executive team, as well as as the customers that we're working with, the key, whether the segments, I have to have that information. And to have that all in my head is asking a lot of an individual, but to be able to get at that information easily and have it mapped and tracked in a way that's clear helps me be effective, because then when something comes up, like a critical decision, like some reality, some customer that wants us to build some set of functionality that just doesn't feel right, I have access to that information. So while it might be efficient for me to go through 50 steps to get at that information, for me to be effective, it should be clear and quick and decisive. And so just to reiterate that is that really the business analyst role requires them to drive understanding through decisive communication decisions. It's your role to look at and have access to all of this information and understand who's involved, who's impacted, what's impacted, so that you can make really clear decisions, meaningful decisions that you don't find 6 months later was a bad decision. Not that that's not possible, but it helps in having that information to make those clear decisions. So what's a poor BA to do? I would recommend looking at your current traceability documentation. What is the scope of it? And ask those hard-hitting questions. Where did this requirement come from? Are there conversations? Are there documents? Is there information from marketing? Is it coming from executives? Is it coming from customers? I guarantee there is a wealth of information outside of your current traceability that is not currently being tracked. I would say look at the content of your traceability. Are you just mapping item IDs to downstream item IDs? Are you providing links to external information? Are you tracking conversations? Do you track sort of a synopsis of what it is? What is the content that you're including in that trace matrix? And again, I think if you read the current volume 3 of Carl Wieger's book, he talks about traceability, and he talks about the difficulty of tracking traceability. It's a lot of work, but building products is a lot of work, and he makes a very funny statement about sitting on a plane after talking to somebody who said that they did do traceability for the plane that he was sitting on, and he thought, I'm really happy they did that. I'm glad they took the time and the energy and the work to do that, because I now feel more confident and safe. Secondly, I would evangelize it's important to the team. Really make people aware of the value of the trace matrix. It's not as I've said, a necessary evil for audit purposes. It's really something that people within the organization should have access to and should value as a meaningful way in which to see the world. I would say teamify, I don't think that's a real word, by the way, the use and maintenance of it. Give people access so that if a decision's made by some team in the development, they have access to it so they can capture and log that decision. I would add people and key decisions to that trace matrix so that information is there. And then lastly, I would consider a tool. I thought long and hard about this. Can this be done in Excel? And the answer is absolutely yes. But the amount of work that takes, again, I think the benefit outweighs the work, but you're going to find more efficiency and you're going to be more effective by looking at tools. So without a tool, back in the day, people didn't do anything. Option 2 is to track it in Excel, and oftentimes there was either wait till the end or it was focused on what's necessary, making it the responsibility of a single individual, and ultimately archiving it somewhere at the end of the day. Now, I'm seeing a lot of ongoing maintenance. I think people are trying to make it a habit. If you're not, I recommend this. Include the notion of people. I don't see this. In fact, I've never seen this in an Excel where it's sort of identified who's the owner of that item, who created that test case, who's the manager of it, like who is the person that I would go and talk to if I needed to get a hold of that person, because that person may leave, and then being able to find out who the next person is. Include key decisions and comments and make it public, and ultimately, last but not least, is allow multiple people to edit. I know that feels scary, but again, this is about organization, alignment, and training and getting people on board with the process, and the process is to include traceability as part of that. So with tools, and I see I'm running out, I want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to wrap this up really quickly here. I'm a huge fan of tools, and I think that over the last 10, even 15 years, tools have done some form of traceability. Every requirements management solution out there does some form of traceability, whether it's textual, hyperlink, whether it's live. The benefits of a tool is that it really is tied to the work that's taking place, and that's fundamentally different. The key things that I would look for in addition that you won't see in many tools is the idea of conversations and people being a critical part of that traceability. And that's really the fundamental difference that I'm calling out here that's going to help drive that alignment and help you rethink what traceability is. And I'll close with this. Obviously, I'm passionate about this stuff. Our product is there to help build complex projects or projects in general. We have things in JAMA like a coverage explorer. We have context. We have impact analysis, suspects, all the things you'd expect. But the key component to this is that we're tying people and decisions to the work that's being done. And so I recommend you checking it out. I recommend reaching out to me if you have questions. I'd love your feedback. We'll take questions now in the time that remaining. I can stay later if people want to stay later. But feel free to go to JAMA'S.com, check out our product, and let's open it up for questions.
Great, Derwin. So yeah, we did have a couple of questions come in, and I just want to reiterate what Derwin said, that you can continue to ask questions in the GoToWebinar question panel, and we will get to as many of them as we can. And if we are unable to, I think we have a couple of minutes to go over, but if we're unable to get to you while we're on the webinar, we'll be sure to follow up with you offline. So I know you just touched on this, Derwin, and I didn't know if you want to expand any more about it, but it's kind of a two-part question, and it's about using social tools to enable traceability. And this person raised like the issue of how can you encourage people to like adopt a tool like that and share all their information on a social tool so you can use that traceability.
Yeah, and that's the million-dollar question, right? That's where it comes down to. It comes down to culture. It comes down to, and this was also part of the conversation that we'd had at that Agile exchange session at Portland State University, where how is your team going to embrace this concept? The reality may be no, and so understanding that you can't necessarily force something that people don't want to do, and that's a tough thing to sort of come to a conclusion on, is recognizing that, oh, my team's never going to adapt or adopt this concept. But it's worth sort of really evangelizing it and finding out to what degree people are open to that, because I have found that being that agent of change, as I like to say that business analysts and project managers really are those agents of change, because you are caught kind of in the middle and you have access to those different folks, and demonstrating how tracking that information provides value. It's amazing to me, oftentimes where you look at that resistance, and yet you find that people spend so much of their day going through their emails or chatting on IM, and really it doesn't do much. I mean, I look at our sales staff and the degree to which they log information in our Salesforce app. It's just something that we train and something that becomes a habit. It's part of your organization's process, and the value that you're going to get is going to benefit from that. I wouldn't discourage whatever collaboration tools. Like, I don't discourage using IM. I don't discourage meetings. I think those are all incredibly important. It's a question of, like, I had a call with a customer yesterday. I went for an hour, took a bunch of notes. Where did those notes go? What do I do with those notes? I think that's a question to always ask after every meeting, after every conversation, is, did we come to some conclusion that's of importance, and how do we make other folks aware of this? And then the question becomes, where do I make other folks aware of this? And that's where I think that the traceability becomes such an important area, because it accomplishes two things. A, it's a place for tracking that information, whether it's in Excel or whether it's in a solution, but it's immediately connecting that to relevant information both upstream and downstream.
Great. This was a kind of a smaller question, but Derwin, could you go back to the slide with your contact info? There was a couple of people asking for it, and they wanted to reach out with you following up after the conversation.
Yeah. I think I just have my Twitter account on there, but I will.
Oh, okay.
I can send.
I'm happy to email that contact information out.
Actually, does everybody get an email after this? I think we send an email to folks who have joined, thanking them for joining, and in that will be my email.
Yeah, we'll be sure to. Yeah, you will. We'll be sure to include Derwin's email address on that. Perfect. how do you, one of the questions that came in was, how do you distinguish different types of relationships between items in traceability in a tool?
Ask the question again?
Oh, sorry about that. How do you distinguish different types of relationships between items using a collaboration tool?
Yeah, that's a good one. I know that, you know, especially people who come from kind of a database world where there's, you know, the data modeling and you have different relationship types, you know, it's a one-to-many, and you have terms or names around derived from or related to. There's lots of complexities that you can add to that. You know, I'm of the philosophy, me personally, that there is a upstream and a downstream. There's a direction to traceability, especially when you're sort of deriving or building additional granularity to what you're trying to define, you know, from a strategic objective down to, you know, we do sort of a agile approach where we do have strategic objectives. We then define sort of themes, epics, and stories, and we sort of go down this flow, and it really just helps us sort of wrap our head around what we're trying to build. It gives us a way to think abstractly and then get more detail, and I work my way up and down the stream. So as I'm building out the stories, I may realize, oh, you know, this epic is too broad or it's not well defined, and so I'll go up to there and I'll say, well, maybe there's actually another theme that we've uncovered. So there's a constant sort of iterative approach that I'm working on. I don't know if I'm answering. Oh, so so the types for me don't matter as much. If there's a need to sort of filter on the types, I could maybe see that factor, but for me, I haven't seen a good use case of that working, of that scenario. And I think in a trace matrix, it just adds another level of complexity, whereas I think the conversations and the people are far more important than the sort of the definition or the type of that relationship.
Okay, we have a couple more questions that came in, so we're going to go a couple of minutes over. But this question was about the size of a project. So what size of projects do you suggest using a collaboration software tool that supports requirements traceability?
Yeah, well, this came up as well. I've talked about this. Obviously, small teams don't need tools, and the big question is, where does that break down? And I think it really varies based on organization. You know, when we started JAMA, it was 3 people, and there was really no need for complex software or even collaboration software. We used email, we used IM, whiteboards. We were in the same room together a lot. But I think as you get into the 20-person range, it becomes like we were using a wiki for a while, and then once our tool was sort of evolving, we started to use our solution, obviously, and we use it today intensively and all the time. But you know, around that 20-person mark, again, it varies, but around that 20-person mark, you've got a lot of different opinions and a lot of different people, and you've got the time to market is maybe changing, and the need to have that sort of history. And it's also not so much about the team size as much as the team maturity in terms of how long you've been in existence. So the product, if it's a brand new product, you're sort of starting with this clean slate. It's that evolution that I talked about where the product is now evolving as you're adding new features and functionality, that the ability to build based off of really understanding your marketplace, understanding your objectives, and not just building based on top of mind or a list of top priority items. It's necessary to have that bigger, broader understanding of where you're going and what you're building, so that you can make more intelligent decisions and not just adding feature set on top of feature set. That's critical. So it really depends on the organization, the product, but I'd say around 20 is where you start to break down a little bit and require, but it's also about time.
Okay, one question came out about your experience, and then there's also a couple, this is kind of off of this last question you just answered, but have you personally seen or helped implement this traceability concept in a large enterprise?
Have I seen where it's implemented in a large, yeah, even more so? I mean, that's.
Have you seen or helped out with implementing this kind of concept?
Yes,
I guess
absolutely. I mean, I think that's. I mean, obviously, with our product, it's a focus of ours is to implement that in large organizations, and that's who's going to see the most benefit. In fact, some of our really bigger customers are dealing with multiple teams, and so here's a scenario where you've got not just one product, but maybe hundreds of products, and you're not only concerned about alignment, but those products are moving in similar directions. There's marketing that's happening around that concept. There's website changes. Really, the entire organization is tied, and this is something that I don't think anyone will argue with, is that, yes, the entire organization is tied to the success or failure of the product, and so why wouldn't we find a way to connect that organization to the direction? And I think we spend a lot of time creating roadmap slides, presentations, whereas the information is there, and why not just connect that to the organization in a way that's meaningful? So I think that's why tools become valuable or help with that. But even an Excel doc, if done right, can provide. It gets a little technical as you get further out into the organization. I don't necessarily see marketing or sales, but if they're trained how to read it, it can become really valuable at that point in time. So I think they're the ones who are going to benefit the most, and not just for a single product, but for an organization as a whole.
Okay. There was also a question about tools to help out with traceability, and I know you're probably going to be a little bit biased in this answer, but they were asking for recommendations on tools, and beyond that, what kind of features are important to look for in something like specific to traceability?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of tools out there, so I don't necessarily have a recommendation. I will be biased and recommend us, obviously, but I think the things to look for, and this is from experience, we get a lot of RFPs, and in the RFP, traceability is the #1 most common. I can almost guarantee. I just actually did some research this last week where I went through all of our old RFPs, and I could not find one that did not reference traceability as a critical aspect of the product. So you're going to find that most products do traceability. The thing that, my opinion, is that most of them do traceability in the way that I referenced early on, that it's more technical, it's more data-centric, it's more linking items together. But what you're going to see, and actually this is sort of the direction, is that the value of the conversations and connecting that information is going to become ever more prevalent in the tool sets. And so, yeah, I think that our focus has been more around the people. You hear us talk a lot about the concept of product delivery, and it's a new concept. It's one that really resonates with folks in terms of, look, we're not talking process or methodology per se. We're talking about how do you engage and align the people. Because when you think back on successful projects or successful products, it doesn't necessarily matter what methodology they do. It matters the team and their ability to embrace that methodology, and the team for them to be how they figured out to be in alignment. So when you look at solutions, I would really recommend evaluating how that solution is going to bring the organization or the team together in a collaborative and more aligned way. Right? That's, for me, the fundamental thing that I don't see on those RFPs. The RFPs are so technical in nature. They're looking for specific features, and they're not thinking, how do we enable our teams to be more empowered, to be more connected, and to communicate better?
Okay, well, now that we're a couple minutes over, we didn't get to all of the questions, but I think we're going to wrap it up, and we will be sure to follow up with you offline. There was a couple more technical ones, and there was also some people that were interested in receiving some documentation, so we'll be sure to follow up with you guys.